Good morning, boys and girls. I'm here to continue with our Lewis and Clark book, the Lewis and Clark Expedition. So here we go. We last where we stopped it was August 1805. They spent about a year on the trail, and they spent the winter in with Native American group along the Missouri, and then they had to move along. So they had to make a second important decision after going towards the Great Falls um, of the Missouri. So in 1805, the expedition came to another turning point, Missouri. Then the Missouri River split into three different directions. Again, a decision had to be made. Which river should they follow? They chose the largest river and named it the Jefferson. The river rapids were so strong that at times they had to carry their canoes. The group finally reached a stretch of high ground called the Continental Divide. And that's the area, the highest point in the middle of the country where it decides where the water flows to the Pacific or if it's eventually going to flow to the Atlantic. The group finally, at this point, the rivers flow west to the Pacific and on the other side, east to the Mississippi. Finally, the party met Sacagawea's people, the Shoshone. She was overjoyed when the chief turned out to be her long lost brother, Kamahuet, whom she had believed to be dead. Having Sacagawea and the group told all the Native Americans that the group came in peace. Women were never part of a warring group. Kamahuet sold the expedition the horses they needed to cross the dangerous Rocky Mountains. As they began crossing in late September 1805, the weather grew worse. Snow, freezing rain, and lack of animals to hunt made the journey even more difficult. Sacagawea's knowledge of routes to eat was helpful, but the men were starving. At times, they had to shoot their horses and mules for meat. At last, they completed their journey through the immense Rocky Mountains. They built 5 dugout canoes, as they had been taught by the Native Americans, and entered the Snake River. They had to go through many rapids and over many cliffs. They lost precious supplies when some of the canoes were overturned. Things improved as the river got wider and more gentle. Here they caught their fill of salmon, and animals were plentiful. The group ate well to regain their strength, reaching the Pacific. So, could you imagine that feeling when they finally got to reach the Pacific, only to mean they had to go all the way back? The expedition had now entered Oregon Territory. Although it was not part of the United States, Lewis and Clark's exploration of the area gave the United States claim to it. The Snake River gave way to the Columbia River, which emptied in the Pacific Ocean. On November 7th, 1805, the morning fog lifted, and the Lewis and Clark expedition could see the great sea and hear the thunderous waves breaking on the rocky shores. The men were filled with happiness and relief. They had reached their destination. The group chose a place to build a camp for the winter. They called it Fort Clatsop, after the Native Americans who lived nearby. For more than 4 months, the men looked for an American ship. They finally gave up hope of returning by sea. They packed up and began the return trip by land on March 23rd, 1806. So they spent that winter in in Oregon, Washington area there, right on the Columbia, and they're hoping they'd see a ship and they would come, and then they can go all, which would require going all the way around South America and to Washington, but that did not happen. On the way home, the expedition followed most of their previous route, but after the Rocky Mountains, Lewis and Clark split up to explore different routes. They wanted to check out more different parts of the land. Clark went by the Three Forks and into the Yellowstone River, and Lewis took the unexplored Marias River to the north. They met at the Missouri River. When the expedition reached the Mandan village in North Dakota, Sacagawea and Charbonneau decided to stay there. Much of the expedition's success had been because of Sacagawea. Her son, Pomp, was now more than 1 year old. Everyone had grown to love them and would miss them. The expedition finally returned to St. Louis on September 23rd, 1806. Huge crowds turned out to welcome them home as they sailed into the city. After nearly 2.5 years, everyone had thought they were dead. Amazingly, they lost only one member of their team. He had died of an illness 3 months into the journey. Lewis and the Clark expedition had survived everything. They had lived through bad weather, starvation, illnesses, contact with more than 50 Native American groups, and many dangerous land and water crossings. Lewis had even been shot once in the rear end by one of his own men who mistook him for an elk. Ouch! They had traveled more than 7,689 miles. Of course, it was a disappointment that a water route all the way to the Pacific Ocean did not exist. However, the journals kept by Lewis and Clark were precious. They had made excellent maps as well as sketches of the land, rivers, plants, and animals. Meriwether Lewis and William Clark led the greatest expedition in early American history. It paved the way for fur trappers, mountaineers, and settlers to go west. It gave the United States a claim to the land west of the Rocky Mountains. It paved the way for a stronger and wealthier United States that would reach the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific, from sea to shining sea. And then here are some of the key glossary. All right. And a couple odd facts here. Meriwether Lewis spent 2,500 that he received on the U.S. Congress on almost 2 tons of goods for the expedition. The first and only person to die was Sergeant Floyd. Um, Lewis and Clark described 178 plants and 122 animals that had never been recorded before. The buffalo were so plentiful in Montana, the group ate almost 9 pounds of buffalo meat a day. Imagine that. Here's a timeline and some other key nonfiction text features, important people, and other places, sources you can go to. All right.